Syrian opposition sources say at least 83 people were killed when regime helicopters dropped barrels filled with explosives on a dozen rebel neighborhoods in Aleppo. These are called barrel bombs. 27 children were among those reported dead in a single day. Local activists called the raids unprecedented. A total of 135 people were reported killed in fighting across the country on Sunday. Nick Payne-Walsh joins me now live. He's in CNN London with more on the latest violence in Syria. And it had been a few months since we'd heard of these so-called barrel bomb attacks in places like Aleppo, Nick.
Well, certainly, but it seems as though over the weekend, the regime, which has intermittently tried to move to retake parts of the city that it's been losing often to more radical Islamists amongst the rebel groups, launched these helicopter attacks. Now, one US military expert said, look, they don't believe actually the Syrian Air Force has any precision weapons at all. And it's these terrifying barrel bombs, you said, literally an oil barrel stuffed with explosives and anything else that could do damage to the human form that have been wreaking havoc across rebel-held areas through regime bombardment in the past year or plus, but specifically this weekend in Aleppo.
Sunday, this was Aleppo's skyline. Barrel bombs dropped from regime helicopters, said activists, up to 25 times. From the street, the dust and ghostly terror of the aftermath. Devastatingly destructive, devastatingly random, it seems. Sometimes dropped on buildings in rebel-held areas. Sometimes, like here, the open spaces of a roundabout where buses picked up passengers. 35 dead alone here, almost half women and children. 80 dead in total, and as ever, no 911, nobody but those nearby coming to help. The searches are by hand for loved ones. Aleppo punished by bombing since nearly 18 months ago. Rebels moved in. Now the regime is trying to come back, as are Al-Qaeda-linked rebels who nearby beat a man like this recently for graffiti against them. Those left in Aleppo caught now between two evils, with little space for life left.
What is remarkable, Hala, is it's almost hard to shock with the conflict in Syria now, where a death toll like that over one weekend would have made headlines a year ago. Now, in many ways, people have become immune, certainly in the area, to the daily horror that's been inflicted upon the Syrian people, more specifically now with very little end in sight to this conflict. Hala?
Let me ask you about Ban Ki-moon. You were at the United Nations a few months ago covering a lot of what was going on a diplomatic level regarding Syria. Ban Ki-moon said something I thought was interesting. We must today in New York, we must have a cessation of hostilities before we begin political dialogue in Geneva regarding the Syrian peace conference. Does that mean no conference if the violence continues?
Well, I asked his spokesman what he meant by that, and his spokesman was clear that it was more an aspirational statement that Ban Ki-moon has been trying, along with Lakhdar Brahimi, the special envoy from the Arab League and UN, towards the Syria conflict, to try and put a reduction of violence as being one of the things they'd like to see happen before this mooted Geneva II conference. It has a date, but still, people aren't clear who's going. And more importantly, they're not clear if the people who are attending are actually going to represent the factions fighting on the ground. We know the Syrian regime, most likely under pressure from Russia and Iran, will be attending, although they certainly don't want to agree to the main precondition for the Geneva process, which is Bashar al-Assad steps aside for a transitional governing body, as the Americans put it. When it comes to the opposition, the real concern is the group going, the Syrian National Coalition, they're pretty much ostracized by those fighting on the ground. Increasingly Islamists on the ground. The Islamist Front now forming the umbrella group representing most rebel factions fighting on the ground, and of course Al-Qaeda-linked militants too. They're most of the groups actually inside Syria waging war on a daily basis. There are other more secular moderates the US have tried to support in the past, including the Syrian National Coalition, the more kind of political arm of the rebel movement here, but they're very distant from what's really happening inside. So the real concern, I think, you may have a peace process, it may go nowhere, but even if it did have any progress, are you going to translate that to actual reduction in violence on the ground? Highly unlikely.